Welcome back, my dear friend. I'm so glad you have found your way here to the hearth once again, just as the long light of the afternoon fades into the soft, comforting shadows of the evening. Tonight's story came to me while I was walking the perimeter of the orchard near my house. I came across an ancient fallen oak branch that looked completely dry and knotty. I loved the shape of it and thought I could take it to my uncle, who is a great talent at wood turning. I brought it inside and set it near the stove. The gentle heat of the room warmed its old grain, and it released the most beautiful, sweet, honeyed scent of deep summer. It reminded me that sometimes the gruffest, barest exteriors are just heavy coats worn by those who are afraid of the weather. When we meet someone who seems a little prickly or a little bare, we often find that all they really need is a safe place to let down their guard. So let us leave the worries and judgments of the day far behind us. Pull our softest blankets up to our chins and take a slow, quiet walk into the lush summer woods. The valley had finally surrendered to the undeniable golden warmth of early summer. The transition was a beautiful, sleepy event that swept across the dales in a wash of deep, rich emerald greens. The thick hedgerows were heavy with the intoxicating sweet perfume of white honeysuckle, and the high meadow grasses swayed lazily in the warm afternoon breezes. At Rosehip Cottage, the heavy winter woolens had been washed, folded and tucked away into cedar chests, replaced by light linen curtains that fluttered softly in the open kitchen windows. It was the very first day of June. Inside the cottage, the great black cast-iron stove was no longer roaring with winter heat, but merely holding a single quiet ember to keep the cast-iron kettle at a gentle rolling simmer. Rosco sat in his high-backed wicker armchair beside the open door, the warm summer breeze ruffling the silver fur at his temples, as he lazily peeled a bowl of fresh, sweet green peas. "The woods are calling today," Rosco said, his voice blending perfectly with the drowsy hum of the garden bees. "The wild strawberries will be showing their first blush of red near the roots of the old oaks. Take the wicker basket and see what the forest has to offer, but keep to the shade where the moss is cool." Berry and Carrotina took the lightweight summer basket, its willow reeds worn smooth from years of foraging, and stepped out into the brilliant afternoon. The lane was soft beneath their feet, dusted with the golden pollen of the blooming pines. The walk to the parish woods was a slow, luxurious journey. The air was thick and sweet, and the entire world felt as though it were preparing for a long afternoon nap. As they approached the deep perimeter of the ancient forest, they came to a familiar solitary clearing. Standing in the absolute centre of this sunlit glade was the most magnificent tree in the entire valley. He was an ancient, towering oak tree named Old Grumplestick. During the cool, rainy weeks of April and May, old Grumplestick was a sight of unparalleled glory. He would produce the most magnificent, thick, brilliantly green foliage of any tree in the parish. But as the bunnies stepped into the clearing on this warm, beautiful first day of June, a deeply melancholic sight greeted them. The air around the great oak was filled with a slow, drifting cascade of perfect green leaves. Old Grumplestick was stubbornly and deliberately shaking every single leaf from his vast canopy. The ground beneath his huge trunk was completely carpeted in lush, green foliage, while his thick branches grew barer and barer by the minute. Unlike the autumn, when leaves turn gold and drift away naturally, these leaves were completely healthy. Yet the old tree was dropping them as fast as he could, his thick bark creaking and groaning with a sour, bitter effort. Within minutes, while the rest of the forest stood lush and vibrant, old Grumplestick stood entirely naked. His dark, knotty branches looked stark and grey against the bright blue summer sky. Without his leaves he looked terribly imposing, jagged, and thoroughly unapproachable, a winter skeleton trapped in the middle of a summer dream. "Oh, Berry," Carrotina whispered, her long velvet ears drooping slightly at the sight. "He has done it again. The very first day of true summer heat, and he has cast off all his beauty. It must be so lonely to be the only bare tree in June," Berry replied softly, his nose twitching as the sour, bitter scent of stagnant sap drifted on the breeze. Without his leaves to catch the sunlight and feed his roots, Grumplestick's sap had nowhere to go. It pooled deep inside his trunk, turning sharp and sour, driving away the cheerful summer beetles and the delicate lacewings that usually tickled the bark of the other oaks. The bunnies slowly approached the clearing, careful not to step on the blanket of fresh green leaves that covered the moss. As they drew near to the great, rough-hewn trunk of the ancient oak, a deep, vibrating rumble echoed from the very center of the wood. It sounded like two heavy millstones grinding slowly together. "Harumph! Good riddance!" the deep, creaking voice of old Grumplestick muttered to himself, the sound vibrating through the roots beneath the bunny's feet. "Too hot, too bright, much better to be bare. Let the others burn their delicate fringes in the sun. I am made of harder stuff. I don't need the sun, and I certainly don't need the company." Berry and Carrotina stood perfectly still, hidden behind a patch of tall, blooming foxgloves. They knew better than to interrupt a grumpy tree when he was in the middle of a good grumble. But as they stood there in the quiet summer heat, Carrotina's sharp ears caught a very different sound. It wasn't the creaking of old bark, nor the rustling of the forest breeze. It was a tiny, incredibly delicate, and cheerful cheeping. She tapped Berry on the shoulder and pointed up into the bare, grey architecture of old Grumplestick's lower branches. There, tucked securely into a smooth, deep, wind-shielded hollow where an old branch had once fallen away, was a remarkably tidy little nest woven from dry grass, horsehair, and soft river moss. And inside that nest sat a tiny, brave family of Whispering Wrens. The mother wren, a beautiful little bird with perfectly patterned brown feathers, was happily feeding her 3 tiny chicks. Normally birds would never nest in a bare tree. They relied on thick, green leaves to hide them from the sharp eyes of the hawks that circled the high thermals. But as Berry watched, he realized the incredible brilliance of the little mother wren. Because old Grumplestick was completely bare, looking like a dead winter snag, the predators of the forest completely ignored him. They hunted in the thick, leafy canopies where they expected life to hide. Furthermore, the smooth hollow in Grumplestick's trunk was perfectly dry, deeply insulated, and completely free from the damp, sour sap that plagued the rest of the tree. To the Whispering Wrens, this grumpy, bare old giant was the safest, most peaceful fortress in the entire parish. Suddenly, a brisk, unseasonably sharp gust of afternoon wind swept down from the high limestone ridges, carrying a surprising chill. The mother wren puffed up her feathers, trying to cover her tiny shivering chicks against the sudden draught. Old Grumplestick let out another loud, creaking grumble. "Infernal racket," the tree muttered, his voice echoing loudly in the glade. "Tiny, noisy, bothersome little pests right in my ear. Why can't they find a nice, soft willow to bother? Harumph." But even as he grumbled, Berry and Carrotina watched in quiet awe. Very, very slowly, with a painful creaking effort, old Grumplestick began to lower one of his thickest, barest branches. He shifted his heavy timber just a few inches to the left, angling the broad, flat side of his limb directly into the path of the cold wind. He didn't say a word to the wrens. He just kept grumbling about the heat and the noise. But his heavy, bare branch formed a perfect solid wall against the draft, instantly blocking the wind and returning the tiny nest to a state of absolute, peaceful calm. Carrotina smiled, a warm light shining in her dark eyes. Old Grumplestick might have dropped all his leaves, and his sap might have turned sour from years of isolation. But deep down, beneath his thick, grey bark, his heart was still soft. He just didn't want anyone to know it. The late afternoon sun began to dip lower, casting long, dramatic fingers of golden light across the mossy floor of the forest clearing. The air was warm and heavy with the hum of sleepy insects, but the clearing of old Grumplestick remained strangely quiet, smelling faintly of the sour, sharp vinegar of his trapped sap. Carrotina took a slow, gentle step forward from behind the tall foxgloves. Her long ears were held low and relaxed, a sign of peaceful intentions that any forest creature or forest tree could easily read. "Good afternoon, old Grumplestick," she said, her voice soft and melodic, drifting up like a bubble in the quiet summer air. The ancient tree stiffened. A series of deep, woody pops and groans rippled through his huge trunk, starting from his roots and travelling all the way up to his highest bare twigs. "Harumph!" Grumplestick rumbled, his bark creaking like a heavy wooden ship in a storm. "Who is that? More noisy neighbours, I suppose. I'm busy being bear, little rabbit. Go forage for your clover elsewhere. I have no shade to offer you, and I like it that way." "We don't need shade, old Grumplestick," Berry said gently, stepping up to join Carrotina. He reached out and placed a warm, soft paw flat against the rough, deeply ridged bark. The wood beneath his paw felt surprisingly cold, almost as if the tree were trying to hold on to the winter frost in the middle of June. "But we saw how you shielded the little wrens from the cold north wind just now. That was a very kind thing to do." A sudden sharp creak echoed from the tree's centre, as if he had been caught doing something he didn't want anyone to see. "Kind? Bah, nonsense," Grumplestick muttered, though his branches lowered just a fraction of an inch, bringing the little wren's nest closer to the bunny's view. "The wind was making my old joints ache, that's all. It was a purely selfish manoeuvre. If the birds benefited, it was entirely by accident." Carrotina sat down cross-legged on the soft carpet of fallen green leaves, looking up into his stark grey branches. "Why do you throw away your leaves on the very first day of summer, old Grumplestick? They were so beautiful last week. The whole valley was talking about how grand you looked." The great oak went completely silent for a long, heavy moment. The only sound was the faint, little cheeping of the baby wrens resting safely in their hollow. When Grumplestick spoke again, his voice had lost its sharp, grumbling edge, falling into a low, weary creak that sounded incredibly old. "You don't understand, little ones," the tree murmured, the vibrations humming softly in the earth. 80 years ago, or was it 90, the summer sun came to the valley not as a friend, but as a furnace. It was a blistering, dry heat wave that lasted for months. My leaves were young and delicate then. They scorched, they burned right onto my branches until they turned to black ash. It was a terrible, blinding pain, and I felt so helpless, standing out here in the open clearing, with no one to shield me. He paused, a slow, sad sigh rustling through his bare twigs. So, I made a promise to myself. I decided that I would never let the summer sun hurt me again. The moment the first hot day of June arrives, I drop my leaves. If you have nothing to burn, you cannot be burned. It is far safer to be bare and grey than to risk being beautiful and vulnerable again. Berry's heart squeezed with a deep, quiet empathy. He understood now. Old Grumplestick wasn't bitter because he hated the summer. He was bitter because he was afraid. He had built a heavy wall of winter around himself to keep from being hurt by the sun, completely shutting himself away from the very warmth that could heal him. "We have to help him, Berry," Carrotina whispered as they walked back down the forest lane toward Rosehip Cottage, their summer basket holding only a few wild strawberries, but their minds completely full of the lonely old tree. "He is protecting those little wrens, but he has no one to protect him. No wonder his sap has turned so sour." "He's carrying the whole burden of the summer all by himself," Berry agreed, his feet making a soft, warm hush sound through the dry grass of the wayside. "We need to show him that he doesn't have to be afraid of the sun anymore." When they arrived back at the cottage, they found Rosco sitting on the shady porch, his wood-carving resting on his knee as he watched the lazy golden light of the late afternoon. The bunnies sat at his feet, their long ears draped over his knees, and poured out the entire story of old Grumplestick, the Whispering Wrens, and the ancient fear of the blistering heatwave. Rosco listened in silence, his thumb slowly tracing the smooth edge of his wooden carving. A warm, understanding smile spread across his whiskers. "A worried tree is a very heavy thing to carry," Rosco said, his voice bringing an instant sense of order and safety to the porch. "When a tree shuts its doors to the seasons, its sap becomes sluggish and bitter. It needs a physical reminder of the sweetness of the earth, and it needs a little help to share the load. Go to the pantry. We're going to brew a sweet root soak." Under Rosco's gentle guidance, the bunnies set to work with slow, deliberate, and very satisfying movements. First, Berry lifted a large, heavy copper bucket from the hook by the stove and filled it to the brim with sweet, cool water drawn from the deepest well in the garden. The water was so pure it caught the golden rays of the afternoon sun like a liquid diamond. Next, Carrotina reached into the dried herb jars, pulling out several large handfuls of dried chamomile flowers, their tiny yellow and white heads smelling deeply of fresh hay and sleepy summer afternoons. She added a generous bundle of sweet clover, which had been dried on the glasshouse shelves back in May, and a small jar of wild, golden maple syrup that Rosco had tapped from the sugar maples in the early spring. Together they stirred the sweet mixture with a long birch paddle. As the herbs steeped in the cool well water, a beautiful, rich and deeply soothing aroma filled the kitchen, a scent that was sweet, honeyed, and thoroughly grounding. "Now for his canopy," Carrotina said. They went to the barn and gathered a bundle of long golden rye straw and dried river rushes. Sitting on the cool grass of the backyard, their paws working in a slow, rhythmic harmony, they began to weave. They created a beautiful, thick and lightweight shade shield, a rustic umbrella made of golden straw that was large enough to drape over a wide branch, offering a perfect, cool sanctuary of shade for anyone resting beneath it. With the heavy copper bucket of sweet tonic hanging between them, and the golden straw canopy tucked under Berry's arm, the bunnies stepped back out into the quiet, cooling evening air, ready to return to the clearing of the bear giant. The twilight had begun to settle over the parish woods when Berry and Carrotina returned to the clearing. The air had grown wonderfully cool and still, carrying the scent of damp earth and night-blooming campion. Old Grumplestick stood as bare and grey as before, his dark branches etched like fine ink lines against the pale violet sky. In the hollow of his trunk, the 3 tiny wren chicks had tucked their heads beneath their mother's warm wing. The forest was holding its breath, preparing for the quiet hours of the night. "What's this? More noise?" Grumplestick's voice was a low, tired creak that barely disturbed the silence of the glade. "I told you, little rabbits, I have nothing to offer you. The night is cold, and I am just a bare old stick." "We didn't come to take anything from you, old Grumplestick," Carrotina said softly, carrying her end of the heavy copper bucket. "We brought you a gift. We brought you something to help with the ache in your roots." Together the 2 bunnies moved to the very base of the ancient oak. They cleared away a small circle of the fallen green leaves, exposing the thick, mossy earth directly above his deepest taproot. With slow, steady, and deliberate care, Berry tilted the copper bucket. The sweet root soak poured over the earth in a slow, fragrant stream. The dry ground drank it in instantly, and a beautiful thick aroma of steeped chamomile, honeyed clover, and sweet maple syrup rose up into the lower branches. For a long moment the clearing was completely silent. Then, deep beneath the forest floor, a soft, rolling shudder ran through the earth. Old Grumplestick let out a long, slow groan. But it was not a groan of pain or bitterness. It was the sound of an ancient giant finally letting go of a heavy burden. The sweet, warming tonic was drawn up through his deepest roots, travelling slowly up his massive trunk. Wherever the chamomile and maple sap touched, the stagnant, sour vinegar inside his wood began to dissolve, replaced by a smooth, golden, and incredibly sweet flow of life. For the first time in nearly a century, old Grumplestick felt a deep, radiating warmth flowing through his old veins. "Oh," the tree whispered, his voice trembling with a quiet, childlike wonder. It feels like the spring rain. It feels so sweet." While the old tree was barking in the soothing warmth of the root soak, Berry quietly scrambled up a nearby birch tree that grew close to Grumplestick's lower limbs. With careful, gentle movements, he reached out and draped the hand-woven golden straw canopy directly over the hollow where the wrens were sleeping. He secured it with soft hemp twine, creating a perfect rustic umbrella that completely shielded the nest from the high, blinding glare of the summer sun and the biting chill of the evening drafts. "There," Carrotina whispered from below. "Now the little wrens have their own roof, old Grumplestick. You don't have to carry the whole worry of the sun all by yourself anymore. We are here to help you shield them." A deep, warm sigh rustled through the ancient oak's bare branches. The grey, weathered bark seemed to soften in the twilight, taking on a rich, healthy, silver-brown hue. Old Grumplestick looked down at the tiny wrens, safe and snug beneath their new straw roof, and then down at the two small bunnies standing in the moss below. Slowly, at the very tip of his lowest branch, right beside the wren's hollow, a tiny, tight brown node began to swell. It grew rounder and plumper in the cool night air, until with a soft, distinct pop, a single brilliant emerald green leaf unfolded itself into the starlight. It was just one leaf, but it was a promise. Old Grumplestick's heart had finally begun to melt. The walk back to Rosehip Cottage was the quietest, most peaceful journey the bunnies had ever taken. The sky was now a deep velvet black, salted with millions of glittering stars that seemed to watch over the sleeping valley. The air was perfectly still, carrying only the gentle, cool breath of the night. When they stepped through the kitchen door, they found the cottage waiting for them in a state of absolute golden tranquility. The single ember of the cast-iron stove was glowing like a sleepy eye, casting soft, warm patterns across the clean pine ceiling. Rosco was already tucked into his high-backed chair, his chin resting gently against his chest, as his breathing rose and fell in a slow, comforting rhythm. Berry and Carrotina hung their light summer coats on the wooden pegs behind the door. Moving with slow, heavy, and incredibly sleepy movements, they poured 2 small mugs of the remaining chamomile tea, carrying them over to the deep armchairs, as they sank into the soft, familiar cushions. They pulled their thick blankets right up to their chinnigans. They thought of old Grumplestick, standing quietly in his dark clearing, his roots drinking in the sweet clover tonic, and his single green leaf resting gently over the sleeping wrens. He was no longer alone, and he no longer had to face the summer with fear. The forest was whole, the wrens were safe, and the valley was entirely at peace. On the mantelpiece, the old clock continued its slow, patient, and rhythmic ticking, measuring out the quiet hours of the summer night. The warmth of the kitchen wrapped around them like a soft, protective cocoon, carrying away the last remaining thoughts of the day. With every slow, quiet breath, their eyelids grew heavier, letting go of the trees, the birds, and the stars. As you let your own eyes close now, and you sink deeper and deeper into the absolute comfort and support of your own bed, let these gentle thoughts wrap around your mind, sinking in with each slow, quiet breath. My day is beautifully complete, and there is nothing left to do. My hands are perfectly still, and my thoughts are slowing down. I am surrounded by warmth, safety, and deep, quiet comfort. I give myself full permission to let go of the world outside. I am perfectly protected, and everything is taken care of. I am ready to drift into a deep, beautiful and restful sleep. Let the slow, lazy pulse of the night carry you deeper and deeper into the quiet dark. The lane is quiet. The little wrens are sleeping under their golden roof. Old Grumplestick is warm and sweet. The valley is fast asleep, and you are entirely safe. All was snug. All was well. Night night.